During Reconstruction, a campaign to overthrow South Carolina's government sparked a constitutional crisis that tested the limits of democracy in the post-Civil War South. This week on C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast, University of North Carolina professor Marcus Gadson explains how constitutional order emerged from the chaos and what this moment reveals about the fragility and resilience of American government. More after this.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Marcus Gadson. I teach constitutional law and civil procedure here at UNC. And I want to begin by thanking everybody for coming. There's a lot of things you could be doing with your time, and the fact that you want to celebrate our Constitution and our constitutional order, I think, says a lot about you. And so I'm glad that you are here. And I feel privileged that I get to share some reflections with you on this day to celebrate our Constitution. When many of us think about our Constitution, our minds invariably turn to Philadelphia in 1787. We think about George Washington presiding silently while intellectual giants debated how to select the President of the United States. Or we imagine Benjamin Franklin coming up at the end of the convention and making a moving plea to the delegates to please sign the final document, even if they had some doubts about it, because they needed to stand together and send a message of unity to the American people. Or we think about Benjamin Franklin leaving that convention and being confronted by a citizen and asked, "What kind of government have you given us?" and responding, "A republic, if only you can keep it." That is an inspiring part of our constitutional story, and it's one that deserves all of your gratitude. And yet it is not the story I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about a story of constitutional crisis. I'm here to tell you about the times where constitution making has torn us apart instead of brought us together. About the times where the people who drafted our constitutions appealed to our basest instincts instead of our better angels. About the times where we have approached democratic collapse and then actually fell into democratic collapse. This is not an inspiring story, but I submit to you it can be an enlightening one that helps us better understand our constitutional order. This is all based off of my book, Sedition, How America's Constitutional Order Emerged from Violent Crisis. And in the book, I am able to make a basic argument that constitutional crisis has shaped American constitutional law and American constitutional history in profound ways that very few Americans today appreciate. I make that argument by asking us to focus our attention as much on our 50 state constitutions as we do on the federal Constitution. And I contend that learning about our 50 state constitutions can teach you things about America's constitutional order that you wouldn't learn just by learning about the federal Constitution. When I say constitutional crisis, I mean things like contested elections where two candidates raise militias and fight each other in the street. I mean things like terrorist organizations waging years-long campaigns to overthrow a government. And I suggest that this is something that has happened repeatedly in American history. In my book, I talk about 6 of these episodes. The Buckshot War in Pennsylvania in 1838, the Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island in 1842, Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, the Brooks-Baxter War in Arkansas in 1872, the violent overthrow of South Carolina's government at the end of Reconstruction, and something I think is of special relevance to you in this classroom and to many of our watchers would be the Wilmington insurrection in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. I suspect that you may have heard of some of these episodes, but if you're like many Americans, I also suspect that some of these are completely new to you and that you may never have heard of them. All of these are episodes in American history that, at least in some quarters, are now obscure, but were prominent in the 19th century that would have captured the national imagination. In this talk, what I want us to do is I want to give you a clear definition of what is a constitutional crisis, because I think that is really core to the claim I make in my book, and I actually think it can help us shed some light when we talk about the question of, are we in a constitutional crisis today? And then I want to explain how constitutional crisis has played out in American history, and then some of the influences it has had on American constitutional law and on America's constitutional order. Let's begin by defining constitutional crisis. And you are probably all familiar with pundits and politicians and ordinary Americans using this term, throwing it around. And I've actually found that too many Americans have used the term too casually, that we use the term constitutional crisis when really we dislike something a politician has said or we vehemently disagree with a choice that a politician has made. When I use the term constitutional crisis, I have in mind something specific. And so the way I define constitutional crisis is as a moment in time when a constitutional order is at serious risk of failure. And that definition, I think, is enough to help illustrate that it's not enough to be enraged by the latest post you saw on Truth Social or X or Facebook, but that this is a really serious designation to give something to call it a constitutional crisis. If I could make an analogy to medical care, I think that would actually help shed some light on what I mean. A medical crisis, I submit to you, would be when the body is at serious risk of either death or having some permanent loss of function. And if we think about medical crises, we can see that there can actually be short-term medical crises and there can be long-term medical crises. What's an example of a short-term medical crisis? In this country, we have a serious gun violence problem. I don't think anybody can dispute that. You could imagine a citizen going about their day, doing nothing wrong, not hurting anybody, who just gets shot in the chest. And that would be a short-term acute crisis. They would then have to go to the emergency room, and depending on what happens, they could die or they could have permanent heart or lung damage or permanent injuries of some other kind that prevent them from living a full life. That would be a short-term crisis where they now have had their life put at serious risk because of a sudden event. But you could also imagine a long-term crisis that has long-term causes. And so I want you to imagine somebody who maybe doesn't have the healthiest diet, who maybe doesn't exercise the most, who maybe didn't get the luckiest in terms of genetic inheritance, and they live for 20, 30 years going about their day until they wake up one morning and they have serious chest pain. And they have to go to the emergency room, and it turns out they've had a massive heart attack and they're going to need emergency surgery. In that situation, I submit to you it would be a mistake just to focus on the specific moment in time where they had the heart attack. You also would want to think about what were some of the long-term contributors in their lifestyle and their environment that contributed to that medical emergency happening. I suggest to you that that same logic is true of constitutional crisis, that you have constitutional crises that can have short-term causes. You can imagine a coup d'etat or something like that that happens suddenly. Or you can imagine long-term constitutional crisis where you have something happen that captures everybody's attention and imagination, but there are long-term causes that contribute to it, whether that is long-term polarization, whether that is excessive authority being concentrated in one person or one branch of government. In any event, what is causing the sudden event that may actually bring all of our attention together could be something that has causes that go back a long time. In American history, I suggest to you that there have been three types of constitutional crisis that we have seen. The first is an election dispute that boils over, where you have people refusing to concede and large numbers of Americans who believe that an election wasn't fairly run or that it was stolen, and that then leads to violence. A second example is going to be what I'll call a constitutional identity crisis. And if I could just take a minute to speak about that, constitutions do much more than give you rule statements for your final exams. It's much more than just rules against viewpoint discrimination or tiers of scrutiny for equal protection. Constitutions are also vision statements. They're about how our society is going to live together. They're about what our shared dreams are and what our shared fears are. And sometimes, just as individuals experience an identity crisis where they can't really decide what they're about, countries also can experience identity crises, and constitutions can also experience an identity crisis. And then third and finally, I have found a recurring pattern in American history where you have constitutional crises that combine the first two types, where you have a crisis that combines an election dispute with a broader ideological conflict about how to define a state's identity or the nation's identity, and those can be particularly destructive. In order to talk about constitutional crisis, I want to actually give you an example of how it is manifested in American history. And to do that, I want to talk about South Carolina during and after Reconstruction, because it perfectly illustrates all of the ways that states have fallen into constitutional crisis in American history in ways that I think can be instructive for our purposes. And as a spoiler alert, our constitutional crisis in South Carolina is going to involve two candidates for governor who both say that they won, both candidates having themselves inaugurated, two parties saying that they control the legislature, two terrorist organizations that killed public officials and ordinary citizens in broad daylight, and a federal government paralyzed over which side to support. So that is where we are going with South Carolina, and we will get there eventually. But in order to understand what happened in South Carolina in 1876, which is a chapter in my book, we actually need to go all the way back to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. I have always argued that the most important of our founding documents is actually not the U.S. Constitution. It is instead the Declaration of Independence, which I know is something that will be contested among many scholars. And yet, the Declaration of Independence is our nation's birth certificate, and it is our founding vision. And let us go back to 1776. Most of you know the broad strokes of the Declaration of Independence. A first draft is written by Virginian Thomas Jefferson. It's edited by a Massachusetts resident by the name of John Adams and a Pennsylvanian by the name of Benjamin Franklin. And then the Continental Congress made final edits to arrive at the version that you learned about in school. But there's some backstory about the Declaration of Independence some of you may not know. You may not know that actually there were multiple drafts, and that in the first draft, Thomas Jefferson actually condemned the slave trade and tried to blame it on King George III, and that was removed at the insistence of some of the delegates to the Continental Congress. Another thing that you may not know is that when Thomas Jefferson wrote that draft of the Declaration of Independence, he actually had by his side a copy of George Mason's draft Bill of Rights to the Virginia Constitution in 1776. And so the Declaration of Independence speaks for all Americans in the sense of it wasn't just the product of one man, it was intended to speak for an entire country. And the Declaration of Independence was shaped by our very first state constitutions, and then it has continued to shape American state constitutions and the federal Constitution for the next 250 years. If you haven't already, you will learn about the 14th Amendment in constitutional law, and you will actually see when you look at Section 1 that after all it is a riff on the Declaration of Independence about the idea that everybody has certain unalienable rights. And it is that language that has captured our attention all of these years later as we come up on our 250th anniversary. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are beautiful sentiments, and they actually obscure as much as they reveal. And so if you look at the Declaration of Independence, look at some of the questions it raises. The Declaration of Independence says that there is an American people that has the right to alter or abolish the government that they are living under with England, that raises a natural question: who are the American people? Is it all people physically living in America? Is it just property-owning white Protestants? Is it women? Is it enslaved people? And coming to an agreement on who count as the American people might seem like such an easy thing, and yet it has taken over 200 years for us to arrive at a definition that you would all recognize today and accept. So who are the people? And to make that even better, which people get to decide who the people are? So who are the people? The Declaration of Independence says that we have unalienable rights to life and liberty, and that we all are created equal. And if I asked for a show of hands, I would hope that everybody agrees that we're created equal and that we have liberty. But now the question is going to be, how do we define liberty and equality? At the founding, this was contested. And it was contested most explicitly in the arena of slavery. Does the right to liberty and equality mean that we have to emancipate enslaved people? And some of our founding fathers said yes. Yes, they said that in 1776, and some of them said no. Not to put too fine a point on it, but all of you would raise your hand and say that you agreed with liberty and equality, but does liberty mean that you can have an abortion? Does it mean that you have the right to get taxpayer funding to pay for a private education at a religious school? Does equality mean that we have to recognize gay marriage? Does it mean that we have to provide every student a certain level of financial support for public education? And what I'm trying to illustrate is that we won't all agree that that is how you define liberty and equality, but then that becomes a problem. If we're going to try to write a constitution guaranteeing liberty and equality, what happens when we have so many different definitions of it? The founding fathers were scared of tyranny. And you should be scared of tyranny too. And yet that also is a question: how do we define tyranny? And at the founding, tyranny looked several different ways. You could be scared of the tyranny of the one. That's King George III. That is a despot. That is a dictator. And by the way, that is a situation that many people live under internationally, is having a dictator or a despot that rules over their lives. You could be scared about having tyranny of an oligarchy or a small group, and for some of you that might look like having a minority faction control a legislature and then be able to systematically thwart majority rule. And then you might define tyranny as being scared of mob rule, so having a majority. And there is this sense, at least among some of you, that a legislative majority might actually be just as tyrannical as a king if you are a minority. All of us actually, when we think about tyranny, I would suggest to you, might actually have a slightly different fear of tyranny that we think is the most realistic fear that we have to guard against. And so if you are more worried about tyranny of the majority, you're going to structure a constitution one way. If you're more worried about having the tyranny of a dictator or a tyrant, it's going to look a different way. The Declaration of Independence is actually a justification for engaging against England in armed rebellion. And so the Founding Fathers deliberately make the point that we have a right to alter or abolish the government. And so then that raises a question too: what is the proper way to alter or abolish the government? Are we limited to following the text outlined in, say, Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution? Or, as the Founding Fathers did, at what point do we have the right to take up arms and engage in a struggle against our authorities? And that has actually happened repeatedly in American history, where people have said, the current government is tyrannical, I'm being oppressed, and I have the right to take up my gun and try to displace them. And then finally we get to the million-dollar question. What happens when we disagree on the answers to these questions? And the answer to when we disagree to these questions is constitutional crisis, repeatedly and viciously and often violently. So having set the table, we're now able to see some of the difficulties that drafters of our first state constitutions confronted in 1776. They are actually getting extremely weighty questions that they have to try to resolve from the Declaration of Independence, and they're having to try to commit answers to constitutional text. And that is a really hard thing, because that involves compromise and deliberation with people that have very different views on these things. And so to illustrate just how difficult it is, I think it's actually helpful to think about constitution drafting in terms of marriage, because after all, the United States is really the world's largest dysfunctional marriage in a lot of ways. So if you look at marriage, there are some issues that are relatively easy to compromise on. So you could imagine a married couple going on their weekly date, and as a piece of free advice, when you get married, you should still go on dates with your spouse. You could imagine one spouse saying, I want to go watch a comedy, and another spouse saying, I want to go watch an action movie. That's a difference of opinion, but you could imagine that same couple spending the time to keep going through different movie options and then coming up with a compromise that satisfies both of them, maybe an action comedy.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So you could imagine that as a married couple where you have a disagreement about which movie to see, but then coming up with a mutually satisfying agreement. But then I want you to imagine that we have a different married couple. And in that married couple, you have one spouse that is adamant that they want to have children. They are just adamant and firmly believe that having children is going to be a core piece of them feeling satisfied in life. And I want you to imagine another member of that partnership saying, I am firmly convinced that I do not, under any circumstances, want children. My identity is tied to being able to live a life free from the constraints that children impose. I judge neither partner, but I can tell you that both partners are going to have a very difficult time living together in the same marriage if they can't agree on a basic assumption of do we have children or not have children. And you see, that is what constitution drafters have to do. They have to answer basic questions. How are we going to define tyranny? How are we going to define liberty? How are we going to define equality? And historically, that has been a real problem, particularly as we will get to in the case of slavery. Slavery is the ultimate case where we either have slavery or we don't have slavery. It's not really possible to say that we're going to kind of have slavery or kind of not have slavery. And it's not really possible to say that we think Black Americans have, half the worth of a white American, but we're not going to say 0 and we're not going to say 100%. And we actually did try that with the 3/5 clause in a way. We did try to actually come up with a mathematical compromise. How did that work? Civil War, 600,000 people dead, so that did not work because fundamentally it could not work. That brings us to South Carolina. And in South Carolina, we're going to have the most violent constitutional crisis that you may not be aware of in American history. And it all stems from a basic dispute over how you define liberty and equality. And so we actually have two irreconcilable constitutional visions in South Carolina. The first one we have comes from 1776. And this is something I've always found to be especially tragic. The same year that we began a revolution against Great Britain on behalf of the principle that all men are created equal, South Carolina wrote its first state constitution. And in that state constitution, they actually spent part of their text complaining about King George III and complaining about Parliament. So that in itself tells you how angry they are, that they're actually literally spending part of their constitution to complain about King George. So they really are angry. One of their grievances against King George, and this is going to be a direct quote, they accused King George of having proclaimed freedom to servants and slaves, enticed or stolen them from and armed them against their masters. And so this is a reference to the British Army offering slaves freedom to fight in the British Army, and they have put that down as a grievance. So South Carolina is actually justifying their struggle against Great Britain in part because their slaves are being set free. If we go a little bit later in South Carolina's constitutional tradition, we see that in 1790, in their constitution, like many other states, they imposed a property requirement to vote. So it used to be actually very common that if you wanted to vote, you had to own a certain amount of property. By the way, in North Carolina, we used to do that too under our first state constitution in 1776. There was a property qualification. And you had to be a free white man to sit in the South Carolina legislature. One of the ways that you could satisfy the property requirement explicitly was owning 10 slaves. And so they actually put the term Negroes in the text of the Constitution. So instead of a colorblind Constitution, they literally have a color-conscious Constitution in 1790. Many Americans, we hear the language, all men are created equal, and our minds kind of skip over a little bit. It just seems like very nice, fluff in a sense. And yet, when you look at American constitutional history, you see that the majority of state constitutions today in 2025 actually have as one of their very first provisions saying something like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, or saying that all men have certain unalienable rights. That is actually Article 1, Section 1 of our state constitution in North Carolina is actually committing to the idea that people have unalienable rights. And at the founding, that was also common. You would have state constitutions that began their state constitutions by saying that all men are created equal. And many state courts have actually found that that is judicially enforceable language, and they've actually invoked that language in a variety of contexts, whether that is closing businesses because of COVID or whether that is abortion restrictions. South Carolina refused to put that language in its first state constitution. And I actually have to kind of admire the intellectual honesty in doing so, because you can't commit to slavery and then in the text of your first state constitution say that all men are created equal. And so what we've got in South Carolina at the founding is we have a white supremacist constitution. Like, that is central to their worldview, is protecting and promoting white supremacy. And that is going to be one of the reasons why we have secession. Sometimes it can be common, to kind of ask the question, why did they fight the Civil War, and sort of pretend that, it's kind of up in the air, they were fighting over tariffs, or they were fighting over abstract notions of federal power. When they seceded, Southern states actually told us why they seceded. They didn't leave it to chance. They wrote secession ordinances. And if you read those secession ordinances, you will actually find that they are patterned off of the Declaration of Independence. So they are actually trying to wrap themselves in the mantle of Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers. And repeatedly, throughout the South, in these secession ordinances, they talk about how they are seceding to protect slavery and how they're worried about the federal government interfering with slavery. More than that, in South Carolina specifically, but generally across the South, these southern states also raise this concern that the Republican Party is trying to force racial equality on southern states. And they actually complain that some northern states let black men vote, and they're trying to force that kind of equality on southern states. So you have southern states seceding from the Union, and they are self-justifying this behavior to promote white supremacy. That's not a 21st century, 2025, millennial scholar trying to impose my own standards on them. That is me reading you what they said in 1861. The Confederacy had a constitution. So they actually write a constitution, and you would be forgiven if you thought that they had just copied and pasted the federal constitution in their own constitution, except for making one change, which is to explicitly protect slavery. And if you read very carefully the federal constitution, you will see that they go out of their way not to use the term slave. You actually, if you do a control find through the federal constitution, they never use the word slave or slavery or slaveholding or anything like it. And I suggest that's because there's a discomfort by the delegates in Philadelphia that they know this is something we shouldn't be doing. South Carolina and the South end up losing the Civil War. And eventually they get put under military rule and required to write a new state constitution to be readmitted to the Union. And as part of that state constitution, they have to commit to black suffrage, they have to commit to abolishing slavery, and they have to commit to letting black men vote for delegates to that new convention and to be part of that convention. And so we actually get a very dramatically different document in 1868 than we've gotten from prior South Carolina constitutions. Very different from what came before. And part of the reason it's so different is because the men who drafted it were different. In 1868, South Carolina hosted the only majority black constitutional convention in American history. And about half of the delegates had been slaves when they were delegates to the Constitution. They had actually served as slaves at some point. And I just want you to stop and reflect on that for a moment. Think about just how much of a change that is to have somebody who was a slave in 1864 or 1865, and now they're at a constitutional convention. And I promise you that people understood in 1868 that this was a big deal. This was getting national media attention. If you look at newspapers from New York and California and Massachusetts, they are reporting on this, and they are recognizing that this is a big deal to have so many black delegates writing this Constitution. And at this convention, they make a number of changes to South Carolina's constitutional tradition. They expand suffrage to make sure that black men can vote for the first time in South Carolina elections, and they very severely limit felon disenfranchisement. They only allow you to be disenfranchised for murder and treason and dueling, because apparently in the 19th century, dueling was a problem in the mid-19th century, so a lot of state constitutional conventions felt like we just need to cut this dueling thing out. You know, like you guys could have a debate or a discussion, or you could sue in court, but you can't duel anymore, so we're going to disenfranchise you for that. They let black men vote, and they let them hold office. They establish a public school system for the first time in South Carolina history, and that system makes no racial distinctions. And in fact, the University of South Carolina was integrated at one point during Reconstruction in South Carolina. More than that, South Carolina elects hundreds of black men to serve in political office, including some men that you've never heard of, but you should have heard of. And so one of them I'll just mention very quickly is Jonathan Jasper Wright. He is the first black state Supreme Court justice in American history, and he actually serves just a few years after slavery ends. He has an interesting life story. He's born and raised in Pennsylvania by free parents. He puts himself through college by teaching himself part-time, so already he's unusual for both whites and blacks in the era by going to college. He reads law back when you didn't have so many law schools in the country, and he learns enough to be able to pass the Pennsylvania bar, but they won't swear him in because he's black. And so the ultimate irony is one of America's first black lawyers had to go to a state that seceded from the Union to protect slavery to be able to practice law. And so he goes there after the Civil War, he's able to get barred, and then he gets elected to the state Supreme Court. And I want you to think about how you might have reacted as an enslaved person to be able to go to a legislature and point out to your son a majority of the members and say that could be you one day when you've experienced chattel slavery, when you've been beaten, when you've been whipped, when you've had a spouse sold from you. Just imagine what a thing that is to be able to say to a child. So this really is one of the high watermarks of American racial progress that I think it's a tragedy too few Americans have heard of. The progress was not complete. And one of the tragedies, I think, of South Carolina's experience is that they did not enfranchise women. And this was actually not because they were unaware of it. Matter of fact, a black delegate actually brought this up and said, hey, if we're going to let black men vote, well, then let's think about other people that are being excluded. And he says, we need to let women vote. So that tells me there were people in 1868 that knew that sexism was wrong, and it was wrong to not let women participate just because of their sex. But ultimately, he was not successful in getting the convention to adopt female suffrage. So I think that that is a good illustration of American history. 1776 was a momentous occasion in the history of human liberty, but it left out a lot of Black and Native American men. 1868 in South Carolina and other states was also a momentous advance in human liberty, and yet that also left out many members of our population. And I think it's fair to be disappointed by that, at the same time that we can appreciate just how much progress was actually made. And so the whole point behind this is South Carolina in 1868 is a place where you have two fundamentally irreconcilable constitutional visions. You have one constitutional vision that says we're going to include Black men as full members of the political process, and one vision that says Black men are inherently inferior and they should be enslaved and they have no business being in the political process. There is just no way that you can compromise on those two visions. Abraham Lincoln gave a speech before the Civil War where he says that a house divided cannot stand. And I'm going to submit to you that South Carolina during Reconstruction was also a house divided, and that you were essentially waiting to see which side was going to be standing when the constitutional house came crumbling down, as it ultimately did in 1876. In 1876, we had, as I said, one of the most prominent constitutional crises in American history. And to further unpack that crisis, we need to think back after 1868's Constitutional Convention happened. We have a new constitution that guarantees Black men the ability to participate in the political process. And so there were actually two terrorist organizations that were started to try to bring down the government. The Ku Klux Klan, who you have heard of, and they were engaged in military-style operations where they were literally organized into companies. They had captains, and they went around terrorizing and whipping and shooting people and telling them, if you vote, we're going to kill you. And sometimes white supremacists would actually murder Black public officials without even bothering to put on Klan robes. And so I'll just tell you about one example, although I could tell you about dozens. In 1870, a Black legislator by the name of Wade Perrin was murdered, and he was caught by a group of angry whites. He was ordered to dance, sing, pray, and then run away, and they shot him in the back, and they killed him. And that was really a warning. This is what we'll do if you try to participate in the political process. Even with all of that Klan violence, that still wasn't enough to overthrow the government. The federal government actually ends up sending some federal resources to try to bring Klan violence under control, and they're able to help for a short amount of time. And then white supremacists actually are dealing with the math problem. South Carolina has a Black majority, and a Black majority is not going to vote to go back to slavery. It really is that simple. And so the only way that they can try to defeat that math is they have to keep enough Black men from voting that they're able to prevail. And this is a good lesson that oftentimes when groups feel like they can't prevail in the normal political process, then they start going outside of the political process. And so in 1876, they're dealing with that same math problem. There are too many Black voters, and so we get a different group, the Red Shirts, because the Ku Klux Klan has become defunct. And they engage in a military-style campaign, and that campaign has two prongs. The first is a military-style campaign where they deliberately try to suppress as many Black votes as they can. And so they go to Republican meetings, they threaten the speakers, they show up at people's houses, they threaten to kill them if they vote, and they actually turn up on election day. And you have people literally standing between the ballot box and Black voters and saying, if you put that ballot in, I'm going to shoot you in front of your family. And so they're able to stop enough black men from voting. And then the other end of it is voter fraud. There was this prominent historian in South Carolina who wrote almost a century ago, and he wrote in his book about South Carolina that there were white men in South Carolina that openly bragged about voting 20 times in one day. And so they would have actually groups of white men riding on horseback, and they'd vote at one poll, ride to another poll, vote there, and then, just kind of make a circuit. And so that is enough for them to have an election dispute.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
And we have actually two men, Wade Hampton, who's the Democrat, and Daniel Chamberlain, who's the Republican. They both are signing different vote totals because Daniel Chamberlain is thinking about all these black voters that weren't able to vote but wanted to, and Wade Hampton is signing, the people who actually did turn up. And neither one of them concede. The legislature is also unclear as well. The Democrats are saying they control the legislature. The Republicans are saying they control the legislature. And they're all going by different vote counts. The Democrats organize separately, and they meet in a different building, and they elect a man speaker. And the Republicans, they meet separately. They elect one of their own speaker. And so one day in December of 1876, you have the Democrats storm the legislature, and the Democrat they've elected speaker actually tries to take the gavel from the Republican, and the Republican orders his sergeant at arms, remove this man. And then the Democrat, he brought along a sergeant at arms, and he orders, you remove this man. So now we're having sergeants at arms, trying to remove each other. So they have that physical confrontation. That doesn't resolve it. Neither man will back down. So then they agree to both try to host proceedings at the same time. So you have a Democratic Speaker of the House trying to preside, and so a Republican will get up and try to give a speech, and he's gaveling them to order, and then a Democrat will get up and try to speak, and then the Republican starts gaveling him down and saying order. So it really is a complete and total mess. And it gets better because both Wade Hampton and Daniel Chamberlain have inauguration celebrations in the legislature. So Daniel Chamberlain has the Republicans inaugurate him governor, and he gives a speech. And then Wade Hampton comes in, and he has himself inaugurated governor, and he gives a speech. And so now we have two men claiming to be governor, and we've got two legislatures in the South Carolina Supreme Court caught in the middle, trying to decide. Both men ultimately end up going to Washington, D.C., and they ask Rutherford B. Hayes, you need to remove this man, he's a usurper. And ultimately, Rutherford B. Hayes ends up siding with Wade Hampton when he agrees to remove federal soldiers from South Carolina that were protecting the Republican government. And Daniel Chamberlain then ends up conceding, and the Republicans concede the legislature. But for the rest of his life, Daniel Chamberlain is going to maintain that he had won that election. He's never actually going to give a concession speech. And actually, I think that if you look at the math, the election probably was stolen from him. So we, in point of fact, have had stolen elections in American history. Democrats committed to a white supremacist vision had actually managed to defeat a government. They had brought a government to a standstill, stolen an election. Eventually, they call a new constitutional convention in 1895, and that constitutional convention writes a document that ends up disenfranchising black men. They impose a literacy test, and there ends up being a vicious cycle. You have a cycle where they underinvest in black public education, leading to a disproportionate number of black voters who can't pass the test. Those who can pass the test, well, we have the red shirts for you, so we'll kill you if you try to show up. And so they end up disenfranchising them. One of the big tragedies in 1895 is you only have 6 black delegates to that convention, where you had a majority in 1868. And 2 of those delegates actually had attended the 1868 convention. So you actually have 2 people attending who are now old men defending what they had done as young men. And Robert Smalls, who is another American who probably should be better known, he actually had saved for his freedom, but didn't have quite enough to buy freedom for his wife and his children. So he does the logical thing, which is steal a ship and sail it to Union war lines during the Civil War. And he manages to take down the Confederate flag literally minutes before a Union warship is going to start shooting cannons at him. Hey, don't fire on us. And he gets a $1,500 prize and ends up then recruiting black soldiers to fight in the Civil War and getting elected to Congress. He argues that 50-something thousand black men had been lynched in the South since Reconstruction. And another real tragedy is at that convention, white delegates were openly using the N-word. And one of the black delegates who spoke, he has asthma, he has difficulty speaking, but he's very keen on going on record to say that he's being called the N-word and that there are white delegates that are referring to them that way. And so at the end of the day, we have a situation where we've had constitutional collapse in South Carolina. One government was displaced by a government that was committed to white supremacy. I promised you some lessons, and it turns out that our American constitutional history has been profoundly affected by constitutional crisis in a few ways. One is that state constitutions are significantly easier to amend than federal constitution is. And one of the reasons often given for this is that if we make constitutions too difficult to amend, then people will be out in the streets. In 1844, a delegate to New Jersey's Constitutional Convention actually says, if we make our Constitution too difficult to amend, the scenes of the Dorr Rebellion will repeat. The Dorr Rebellion is a reference to the Civil War before there was a Civil War, where you actually had a man who sponsored his own Constitutional Convention, raised a militia to put it into force, and then ended up trying to take over an armory building because the Rhode Island legislature kept insisting on a property requirement to vote. And so this New Jersey delegate says we need to make it easier so that there won't be Thomas doors in the future. If you look at state constitutions, they're almost universally easier to amend than the federal constitution. Another way is that state constitutions are less respected. We have Constitution Day, and almost all of you expected something about the federal constitution as opposed to our state constitutions. And part of that is because the federal constitution has survived its crisis moments. It has survived World War I and World War II and the pandemic and the Civil War. State constitutions have often failed their crisis moments, as South Carolina's constitution did. And because of some of these constitutional changes that have taken place, they still have provisions like literacy tests. North Carolina still has a literacy test in the text of our state constitution because of a white supremacist revolution in Wilmington. And so that raises an uncomfortable question. Do state constitutions deserve respect when they still have literacy tests? Do I, as a scholar, have the right to tell you to respect a state constitution that still, today in 2025, has provisions designed to keep out members of the community from participating? So I argue in my book that constitutional crisis has had tremendous consequences. And I want to end with this. Constitutional crisis is a present threat in the American constitutional experiment. And what I would like to do is end by reading something from Ronald Reagan. It's actually one of my favorite speeches he gave. It was his inauguration address as governor of California. He says, "Perhaps you and I have lived too long with this miracle to properly be appreciative. Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by way of inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people, and those in world history who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again. Democratic collapse in America is possible because it has happened. If you talk to former slaves after the Civil War, they would have told you that we have lived through democratic collapse. Never take America's liberty or its constitutional order for granted." With that, we have actually time for, I think, one or two questions. Again, the book is Sedition, How America's Constitutional Order Emerged from Violent Crisis. You can order it basically wherever books are sold. So we have time for one question, I think. Yes, go ahead. And there's a microphone up here.
Thank you. 1895 is a year that you highlighted there. I couldn't help but think about the fact that that was the year in which the most famous at the time, because Frederick Douglass passed away right around then, black man in America, Booker T. Washington, gave his famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, Atlanta Exposition speech, "Cast down your buckets where you are," and urged black people not to engage in politics. Would you talk about that and its relationship and significance to what you just talked about with respect to that year and what was happening in the country and its impact ultimately on constitutional order?
Okay, so if I could just restate the question, I think what I'm hearing is how was the attitude that maybe we shouldn't be trying to participate in the political process affected by some of this violence that happened in South Carolina and other places, and then what were some of the long-term consequences of that attitude? Well, I actually think that part of that is really an atmosphere of hopelessness. I think he's telling you that in a context where he feels like if you vote, it may not matter. Why might it not matter? Well, red shirts in South Carolina literally just overthrew a government. You tried writing a new constitution, you tried voting, you tried going to Congress, and they literally just killed you for it. So what you should try to do is focus on economic development, build some economic power, and really that's going to be how we are independent and able to take care of ourselves. Long term, obviously, that didn't end up being the approach in the sense of you had people continuing to fight for voting rights for black Americans. But there is one underappreciated element of this, which is that because of what they did in South Carolina, you have the Great Migration start to take place. And it's not just South Carolina, but because you have so much violence going on there and so much political repression, you have millions of black Americans actually leave places like South Carolina and they go to places like New York or New Jersey or Indiana, places where they can vote. And here's what I always say about that. There's different ways you can vote. You can vote with ballots, you can vote with bullets, and you can vote with your feet. And South Carolina's white supremacists prevented blacks from voting with ballots. They did vote with bullets, basically, to steal an election. And so then that left black South Carolinians with the option to vote with their feet, which they did. And there is an irony to that. Northern states gained representation in the Electoral College and in Congress with an increased black population that then gives them the power to pass things like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So ironically enough, they were kind of hoisted on their own petard. They were too successful in getting blacks to leave the state that they now end up being a numerical minority that can now have northern states have their way. So they ended up losing because they won, in a way. I think there might be a 1 o'clock class, in which case this class is dismissed, I suppose.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.